So the way it works typically for an agency such as the World Food Program or for other UN agencies and indeed most NGOs and other players involved, where you've got donors who are voluntarily providing you resources, you have to have a period of time during which you intend to accomplish certain goals, to achieve these objectives based on a certain plan, a strategic vision. In our case, we call this a country program. Typically, a country program will go for a 5-year period. This is just to give you an idea specifically in Bangladesh how we would approach the strategic priorities. We would, through our work in the country, we as staff posted there would work with various design and development or assessment missions to take a look at the situation based on what we've been doing previously, what's been working, what hasn't been working, how to apply those lessons to the next program. So this is, let's say, the next 5-year country program. We will go to our executive board, that is the member states, in our headquarters in Rome during an executive board meeting, and they meet 3 or 4 times a year. And we would sit with them, and we have a document prepared where we explain what our objectives is, how we're going to accomplish this, who the partners are and such. And these would be the objectives that we would use. And this is from an actual country program a few years ago. So I would, as a country director, I would sit down with the board and I would go over these particular objectives. So first off, we're simply there to improve nutrition and related health practices of expectant and nursing mothers and children. And we would do this typically through what we call maternal child health programs. Investing in human capital through education and training. That's essentially school feeding programs that you've heard about. We would focus on enabling households which depend on degraded natural resources to shift to more sustainable livelihoods. So those millions of people who live in those chore areas, those sandbar areas, for example, move them away to more sustainable areas of the country where they will not be flooded from year to year and lose all the assets which they have. Mitigate the effects of natural disasters on the most vulnerable, and then work with families to help them gain and preserve those few assets which they have. For example, one intervention was a Food for Work program, working with communities in some of the more flood-prone areas to simply raise their houses just a few inches, and oftentimes just these small huts where they live, just raise them a few inches can make a huge difference between losing everything when a flood comes and weakens the house and washes it away or not. So many of these floods in Bangladesh, remember, are not necessarily big, huge whoosh typhoon kinds of floods. What happens is the country's like a big sponge. The water comes and comes and comes from the Himalayas down into the country during monsoon, and it just slowly absorbs until it can't absorb anymore, and then it floods up like this. It doesn't necessarily flow quickly unless you're in the river areas. And so in many communities, it might need nothing more than just helping them on a Food for Work basis type of program to raise the level of their houses just a few inches. Now, the way that we then understand best how we can target the neediest, because remember, even though this particular program in Bangladesh is one of our largest, based on the needs, maybe we're able to target 5–10% overall. And you've heard us discuss vulnerability assessment mapping. Professor Alexander has explained in detail the various indicators and such which you look at. VAM was actually invented and conceived in Bangladesh, and it's one of our most well-developed VAM functions in any country office. So food security and vulnerability assessment is key. Why and when do conditions of hunger and vulnerability exist in any given time? Why is that? Where are those situations? So we have geographic targeting, trying to understand where the hungry are and where the most vulnerable are. Which households and communities are most likely to face conditions of hunger at any given time? Understanding, again, the beneficiary assessments. Emergency assessment and monitoring. What is the impact of disasters on the food security and vulnerability conditions of the affected population? And then finally, the role of food aid. What is an appropriate approach to assist those who are in this situation. It may not simply be providing free food and that's it. Wherever we can, especially in these kind of conditions where we're looking for a development outcome and a more sustainable approach, that indeed is the last thing we typically will look at doing. But what is the appropriate approach? This is often our key concern. This is the poverty map of Bangladesh, the proportion of population below the lower poverty line. The lower poverty line is the one I mentioned, the 1,800 calories per day. And remember I explained that anyone consuming 1,800 calories a day, that's not sustainable long term. Something is going to happen serious and maybe mortal in their life. This map, just to point out, you see the logo in the corner here, and then the other one in the other corner, that's WFP, and then the government of Bangladesh. This is a joint project done together. We're trying to build capacity, as I've explained, with this government, as with any government that we work in, so they can do all this type of mapping themselves. And you can see then the poverty incidence down in the lower corner. The dark blue is covers 37 to 55% of the population in that particular county, in this case, living below the lower poverty line. Gives us a good idea where the ultra poor live in Bangladesh. And by having that level of information then, we have a good basis for resource allocation for vulnerable groups and understanding where they are. And this is an allocation map that we've then agreed on with the government to understand, taking all the indicators that you've heard Professor Alexander explain, taking all those indicators and then split the whole country up as to where the most food insecure areas of the countries are, based on all the indicators of access to education and food and land and labor and such. And the red areas, you can see, correlate very much to the blue areas that you saw in the previous poverty map. But this map is particularly important because this is the map in countries like Bangladesh that we in the international community, who are all working on some aspect of food insecurity and trying to assist communities on their terms to improve the situation, we all have an agreement then through this type of process. And it helps tremendously to allocate scarce resources for all of us, to work together in areas where we can maximize an impact. We'll have much more impact if we can come in as a group of donors with our comparative advantage and all work together, complementing each other in these various programs, much more so than if we have ad hoc presence here and there throughout the country with minimum coordination and indeed even duplication at times. It's very important. And also it's very helpful because this can help to avoid many of the diversion issues, many of the so-called corruption problems that I've talked about in previous lectures, where we, all of us involved in this type of work, can often be under undue political pressure to favor certain areas for the wrong reasons or political reasons. Members of parliament, ministers of government who are interested in having our resources in their particular communities or regions, and we can say, Minister, sorry, you know we have this agreed process that we've all been supporting so that we can target and make maximum benefit of the donor assistance in your country. It's a very powerful argument and helps a lot to keep everything transparent and above board as to why all of us, again, not just the World Food Program or even the UN system, why all of us are involved in working in particular areas, that we have an agreed understanding of what the needs are and how we can best assist. So for WFP, again, this just gives you an overview, just a snapshot of time. We'll have on an annual basis, again, this is a 5-year program, but on an annual basis, we will target over 2 million people with our development activities. 95% will be female. The school feeding programs will target 1.2 million. The refugee program, the PRO, is one of our internal acronyms for refugee operation, the 22,000 that I mentioned. So overall, when you add them all up, we'll have an annual total of people who benefit in some way from our assistance will be over 4 million. And over a 5-year period, then that will be 14 million beneficiaries, which represents 70% of the total ultra poor. So a snapshot again in a country like Bangladesh, in this case, it's 67 million people on an annual basis, which is quite large and significant in any country. Just to give you an idea of UN assistance in Bangladesh, and again, this is just a snapshot. It could be less or more today. Because of the extreme food insecurity in a country like Bangladesh, and this is often the case for the World Food Program, in countries like that are extremely food insecure, typically you will find that we have a very large percentage of the presence. In this case, 50% of UN assistance is through the World Food Program. FAO is 2%. The Food and Agriculture Organization, that's mainly capacity building in the agricultural sector. UNDP, the UN Development Program, UNICEF, working with children, and then UNFPA, UNHCR, that is the refugee organization who we work with, and they're focused on the Rohingya refugees that I mentioned. So overall, government and donor multi and bilateral food-assisted programs are still making up only 2% of the government annual development budget, but 60% is from the World Food Program operation. So that's quite large, but again, just keep in mind that the government is then putting a lot of its own money into development in the country. So again, a snapshot, typical. In a case like Bangladesh, this is the current annual planning figure for the $65 million. There's the tonnage figure, and this gives you an idea of the various countries who are involved. So there's the multilateral, as I've explained, the multilateral meaning WFP. There's the bilateral, and the bilateral, again, refers to individual countries, in this case the European Commission and Australia. And then uniquely in Bangladesh, but more so in many countries today, governments are putting their own scarce resources into these programs and making up significant percentages in fighting the war against hunger. This is a very, very key development. Well, the multilateral donors then are these listed, Australia, Canada, France, Japan, Norway, and the USA. And then the bilateral donors, Australia, European Commission, and the government of Bangladesh. You see, in Australia, they're on the list twice. So for the Australian government in particular, one of our key partners in Bangladesh, they feel that this program is so important that they separately contribute to the multilateral channel to the UN, to WFP, and then also their own bilateral program, which they also have us implement on their behalf. So to give you an idea then of each program, this is the first program. It's called Vulnerable Groups in Development, VGD. This is the largest women's poverty alleviation program in the world, targeted on women. Millions of women cycle through this program every 5 years through the 5-year country program that I mentioned. There will be a film that will be part of this class called Touching the Sky that will explain in some detail over about a 10-minute period with interviews with the women and that about how the actual strategy works. The 24-month cycle where food aid is provided for 5 members on average of the family, and that is the incentive for the women typically to engage in the training activities that are part of the development package, training on life skills, income earning opportunities. It's very important that in this case we do provide the food requirements for the woman and her family, as explained, on an average of 5 per family overall. And the reason there is that if you think for a moment the way that the families are functioning, if they're earning roughly $1 a day and spending 80 cents of that dollar on their next meal, how they're spending their time. They're basically living from hand to mouth. Again, remember, these people are disenfranchised, perhaps living in a ditch in the side of the road, got very little to work with. You may have all these great ideas as a development worker as to how you can help, but they're meanwhile worried about feeding themselves, a very basic need. So you need to deal with that need first and foremost. And once you do that, then you have their attention. So when you say to these women, right, for a 2-year period, 24 months, we will supply your basic food requirements. Boom, now we have their attention. Then we can work on providing the support for these development packages. This is where the Grameen Bank works with us on microcredit. There are all kinds of various skills that these women learn simply to start at a very modest basis to start earning income so that they can lift themselves out of poverty.